Welcome, everyone, to this podcast recording of Ptomaine Palace, a history of Bishop Mountain Hall from 1957 to 1970. Bishop Mountain Hall and the three residences which it serves were originally a response to a problem that McGill had struggled with for much of the mid-20th century. The school was experiencing a significant increase in the amount of students, particularly students coming from outside of Quebec and Canada. These new students started to settle in the neighborhood immediately to the east of McGill, establishing that area as the McGill Ghetto. In the mid-1950s, the housing potential of the area around McGill was beginning to be pushed to its limits for a variety of reasons. At the time, there were only two major McGill residences, each with their own dining hall. There was the men's residence of Douglas Hall, up the hill from campus, and Royal Victoria College for the women, just at the southeast edge of campus. The McGill Office of Physical Resources acknowledged that the only way to solve this problem was to create more residence space for its students. The task of creating a new men's residence program was given to Stanford Reed in 1957. Reed was originally the warden of Douglas Hall and would later go on to be the first director of men's residence. The committee, led by Reed, ultimately established that not one, not two, but three new residences were to be built, all sharing the same central office and dining space of Bishop Mountain Hall. The residences were built to hold up to 800 students, while Bishop Mountain was designed with the potential of serving up to 1,100 people 3 meals a day each. The residences were quickly constructed and opened to its first residents in the fall of 1962 with a great degree of anticipation from students, staff, and administration alike. Unfortunately for McGill, the honeymoon phase for Bishop Mountain Hall did not last long. The first documented sign of student disappointment with the food and services at Bishop Mountain Hall was in an issue of the McGill Daily on November 15, 1962. Only 2.5 months since the residences had opened. The student writes,
I am an unfortunate inmate in this hallowed institution's brand new, beautiful residences. I have visited 27 countries and have been able to digest 27 different varieties of food, but I can assure you that never before have I tasted that strange substance being served at Bishop Mountain Hall in the name of food.
The student goes on to describe all the ways in which the food at Bishop Mountain Hall fails to meet their expectations. Not only is the student upset with the quality of the food, but as well as at meal times, it takes up to 30 minutes of standing in line for residents to actually receive their food from the counter. The student eventually signs off from the letter by saying,
P.S. Please don't print my name, or they'll give me a second helping.
Beyond the quality of the food and timeliness in which they served the food, the students in men's residence struggled with Bishop Mountain Hall because of the way in which the payment system was structured. There was a good amount of internal debate over the way in which the residents would manage student payment for food from the dining hall, dating back to when it opened in 1962. But they ultimately settled on a year-long prepaid meal ticket, which could only be redeemed at Bishop Mountain Hall. This meant that students were expected to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day of the week only at that dining hall. As is still the system in the majority of McGill's downtown residences, it is compulsory for students to buy a full year meal ticket. This was, and is, not unique amongst university residences in Canada, but McGill was unique with the rigidity in which they enforced it. Many of the students in men's residences chafed against the monotony of food from Bishop Mountain Hall day after day after day after day. The conditions in Bishop Mountain Hall did not improve over the coming years. In fact, they worsened dramatically. At the end of November of 1964, Bishop Mountain Hall experienced a full-blown food riot at the hands of its students. These riots came to be known as Bishop Mountain Hall bread riots. The troubles began when, on suspicion that students were hoarding bread and butter in their rooms, a residence administrator by the name of Robert Bray searched several student rooms for bread along with some of his resident staff. The Daily actively reported on the bread situation starting on November 25, 1964.
An ultimatum yesterday limiting the consumption of bread and butter at Bishop Mountain Hall has renewed student administration friction.
Upon finding slices of bread, rolls, and butter in the rooms of students, Bray imposed a rule of 4 slices of bread and 3 pats of butter per student per meal. The students showed their displeasure with this new rule by smearing the tables of the cafeteria with butter and picketing at the doors of Bishop Mountain Hall. This acted as the final straw for many students. An enterprising group of students even formed their own dining hall within residence, calling it the Last Stand.
The residents of McConnell Hall have at last found some sort of solution to the problem besettling these starving inmates. The solution is called the Last Stand, a small concession stand to be set up right in McConnell Hall to dispense necessities such as hot dogs and ice cream to the hungry hordes.
Beyond being the first large-scale display of student frustration, this event contains the first mention of Robert Bray, who would go on to be the chief administrator of men's residences and food service. In 1965, Stanford Reed, the man who had developed the idea of men's residences and acted as residence director, left McGill to go to University of Guelph. Taking his place at the head of residences was Mr. Bray, assuming the title of business director of men's residence and food services. However, with Reed leaving, wardens took more control of their own residences, while the head administrator took more control over Bishop Mountain Hall. It's with this transition in power that the students truly begin to resent Mr. Bray.
Bray serve shit. Bray serve shit. Bray serve shit. Bray serve shit.
After a series of letters to the editor of the Daily in 1966, including complaints regarding the lack of variety and poor quality of ingredients, the residents felt the need to express their frustration in a more dramatic fashion. A much more dramatic fashion. Mr. Bray arrived to work on the morning of October 31st to see an effigy of himself hanging out of the top floor of Gardner Hall, with the slogan, "Bray serve shit," written across its chest. The level of discontent was growing among students, to the point that McGill administration, outside of residence office, including the vice principal, were beginning to take notice. Many students and residents brought their concerns to the Students' Union, which they published in a public address in 1967.
Due to the less than palatable meals which emanate from the kitchens at Bishop Mountain Hall, it is earned the nickname Ptomaine Palace. The majority feel that the quality and types of food being served can be improved so as to allow one to consume the needed amount of calories.
After hearing from students, University Residence Council, and the Student Union since the inception of Bishop Mountain Hall in 1962, the McGill Senate decided to launch a subcommittee on residence policy in 1969. The committee was ultimately formed containing 7 students, 7 non-students, and a non-student chairman. There was a number of items that they were tasked with investigating, but primary among them was to better the food services of residences, particularly those in Bishop Mountain Hall. In an external audit of the McGill Men's Residences Food Services by Maurice Novak, he declared that the department was chronically mismanaged at all levels, and that the committee would be wise to recommend the dismissal of Robert Bray. While McGill did not part ways with Mr. Bray, they did adhere to the other recommendations produced from his report, including the hiring of a dietitian, as well as more staff members with experience in operating a kitchen. With the hiring of this additional staff, the change was made in which Mr. Bray had less control over the actual food than ever before in his career. Along with the changes in food services, the men's residences were opened up into co-ed residences the following year, as well as a number of other changes. This marked a major regime change in every level of operation and residence. Despite the changes made, the food services of residents would continue to struggle, as there would be 2 more Senate subcommittees on food services in the 10 years following 1970.